Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren Cass. I'm the chief economist at American Compass. And today we have, as usual, a fascinating conversation. It is with Richard Werner, an economist and professor and coiner of the term quantitative easing. We don't do a lot of monetary policy here at American Compass because, frankly, I find it very confusing. But Richard is a genuine expert and wonderful communicator on the issue. And I think it is a really great conversation about a lot of the actual underlying principles that drive monetary policy. Things like where does money actually come from? What causes financial crises? And what is the role of a central bank in addressing it? Really found it especially nice that at the end, we ended up finding a lot of connections between the work he does and the way he thinks about investment and the work that American Compass does in trying to distinguish the kind of real investment in productive capacity from financing consumer debt and Wall Street speculation that obviously does a lot less for our economy. So hope you'll enjoy that. Before we get to it, got to tell you about what else is going on at American Compass this week. On the Commons, we've got a number of great pieces. Drew Holden, our managing editor, on Democrats' disdain for democracy. Henry Olsen, the fantastic political commentator, comparing Kamala Harris's rise to the ascent of former New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. And then later in the week, we'll have a piece on toaster production and what we can learn from toasters about U.S. manufacturing from Fred Bauer. The Compass Point is from EPPC's Patrick Brown on family policy and childcare in particular. And of course, as always, you should be subscribing to Understanding America. On Monday on the Substack, we talked about J.D. Vance and what his comments suggest about a possible Trump-Vance family policy. And on Friday, we will be back with yet another set of exciting links. So go read all of that. But first, listen to our conversation with Richard Werner. And we're joined now by Richard Werner. Thank you so much for joining us, Richard.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This is, I think, going to be a great conversation, one I've been looking forward to in particular, because this is genuinely an area where I admit to not knowing nearly as much as I should. And so to some extent, I will be learning along with the listeners. Feel free to correct me. But I think the topic generally is monetary policy and more specifically making sense of what is actually going on with central banks, the Federal Reserve in particular. We hear people say they're just printing money. They say, no, we're not. We're doing these other things. Uh, I guess I'd like to understand what what they actually are doing and what it means for the real economy. So maybe let's start with the quantitative easing concept, which kind of is in the aftermath of the financial crisis, the Great Recession. This is obviously an idea you're closely associated with. What was actually going on at that time, and what was different in the policy response than we might have seen in the past?
Yes. Well, I mean, I proposed this originally in 1995. Can't believe it's almost 30 years now, for Japan. I was in Tokyo then as a chief economist for British Investment Bank, and I had been one of the first to warn of the coming banking collapse since 1991. It was quite clear that it was going to happen because they created such a huge speculative asset bubble, and that was going to actually take several more years to unwind, and that usually, and when it's that scale, brings down the banks. And so, the original idea of QE was simply the realization that when you get into a dire financial crisis like this, I mean, and I was still only predicting it because most people thought for many years this nonsense is not going to happen. Japan is strong, the economy is strong. How can there be a big banking crisis? The 10 biggest banks in the world were Japanese, in the 90s.
That's
um,
that's probably a sign of a bubble, if
well,
if
exactly.
I
And
had to
you
guess.
had all these, but usually, sort of the the reporting then is quite lagging because it was all this hyperbole how Japan was going to run the world and the 21st century is going to be the Japanese century and all these things. Um, but it was quite clear to me that it was going to all come down because it was really based on excessive bank credit creation. I'll come back to that. And so creating this asset bubble. And then what happens next if you don't take the right central bank policies is you will get a banking system in crisis, and that means the banks will not lend. And that will then also affect the real economy, and you get unemployment, a recession, shrinking economy, and that's quite unnecessary. And to me, it looked like it's going to be a big problem, which turned out to be quite true. 20-year recession in the end, but unnecessarily so, because I designed QE, quantitative easing, as a way to very quickly get out of the problem that I was predicting was going to happen. Namely, is two parts of this QE. So QE1 is to clean up bank balance sheets. The central bank goes out and buys from the banks the non-performing assets. So you shift them to the central bank, they can't do any harm there. And the banks immediately have clean balance sheets, very liquid, very strong. But I also figured that it's not going to be enough on its own, because the banks are going to be so shell shocked because of what happened. They realize that their lending has gone sour. They will still be risk averse and not increase bank credit. And when you don't have increased bank credit, then the money supply doesn't grow, and you can't grow the economy without an increasing money supply. It's one of those, um, you know, uh, fundamental requirements. By definition, you see, what is growth? Growth means more transactions this year than last year, but that means you need more money, and that's only possible if more money is put into the system. And the system we have is where money is created by the banking system. 97% of the money supply is created by banks through lending. And when they are shell shocked, risk averse, they're not going to do this. So then you're going to have a long recession, even though you've cleaned up bank balance sheets, but you want to kickstart the recovery. And so I had a second version of QE. The first version, to recap, is the central bank buys the non-performing assets from banks. And the second version is the central bank buys the performing assets from non-banks. That is a way of forcing the banks to create new money, because when the central bank buys assets from other players, not banks, non-banks, anyone, and in 95, 96, I proposed this idea they could just buy real estate because the property market was going to be in a big slump, and Tokyo barely has any parks. The green surface space is very small for a major city. So create Bank of Japan parks. The central bank buys real estate, just turn it into parks, and that's it. That alone would actually be a huge stimulus, because the sellers of the land, um, they're going to be paid by the central bank. How's that happening? Well, they tell the central bank their bank accounts, and therefore the central bank instructs the banks to pay them. It gives the banks reserves, and the banks then create credit, new money, which then goes out of the banking system into the non-banking system. And that's a very powerful way to rev up the economy in no time, which was going to be necessary because I foresaw deflation, shrinking GDP, everything contracting, and that's a fast way of blowing it up again. Now, that was the original QE1 and 2. Now, the Bank of Japan didn't take these policies in the 90s or later. It did what I call fake QE, or QE3, a third type of version, where they just buy bonds from banks, so performing assets from banks, and it marginally helps the banks, but it sort of creates and continues the asset bubble. And in the bond market, it doesn't really tackle the key problem. But when the 2008 crisis happened, originating in the US, um, the Federal Reserve took the proper QE1. And that's because, in the 90s, when we had these debates, also, I published this in the Nikkei, Nihon Keizai Shimbun, the Japanese main financial newspaper. They own the Financial Times now. Um, this other economist joining, and Ben Bernanke was one of those joining those debates. How, what can be done if, this is going to be a bigger problem.
I think it's really helpful, actually, I guess, to start with the Japan context, because it's sort of abstract. Certainly for American listeners, it's not as fraught in all the debates of what did and didn't happen with the financial crisis. But there are a bunch of concepts there I want to dig into a little bit. And the first is just this point that banks create money, which I think is a somewhat counterintuitive concept for a lot of people. Uh, Tell me if this is a fair way of describing it. Essentially, the issue is I, as a saver, put my money in the bank. So I think I still have that money. The bank turns around and lends it out to somebody else. Now somebody else has that money, but essentially I still think I have it too. And there's now more money. Is that wildly oversimplified, or is that essentially what's going on?
Well, I think the simplest is to literally check what happens when a loan is being granted, because that's actually where where these things happen. That's also where in economics there's been a dispute for the last century. How do banks actually work? I mean, it's if you think about it, it's quite surprising, but there has been a big dispute. There's been three theories of banking. The one that, if you open a modern finance textbook, you will see, and then in all the finance journals, economics journals using, is the so-called financial intermediation theory. And that one says there's no money creation. Banks collect deposits, they do their credit checks analysis, then they lend out the very same money. So they're just sort of, reallocating existing deposits. Um, that's still dominant against any evidence. And then there was an older one, the so-called fractional reserve theory, and some of your viewers will have heard this one. That one was dominant until the 1960s, but some textbooks, kept it a bit longer. And that one says each individual bank is just an intermediary, gathers deposits and lends out the money. But in aggregate, as the banks interact, you get what they call a money multiplier, multiple deposit expansion, and money creation. But there's a third one, which is the oldest, and that one was, this is over 100 years old, and that one said none of that is true. Banks are actually not intermediaries. Each individual bank creates money when it gives out a loan. And so I did the first empirical test. I mean, that's the scientific thing to do, isn't it? If there's different theories, well, let's test them. And I managed to find a bank that was happy to open up, their accounting, their IT system. I took out an actual loan, 200,000 euros, and it was all documented and recorded. The question was, when the loan was given to me and I actually transferred the money out of the bank, where did that money come from? Was another account debited? Was it transferred from inside or outside the bank? Financial intermediation theory should be somehow connected to deposits, or the fractional reserve theory should come somehow from reserves, excess reserves, or where does it come from? Well, we found that it didn't come from deposits, didn't come from reserves, didn't come from the central bank. It was newly created by the bank. So, come back to your way of putting it. Essentially, as I take out the loan, my account gets credited by the bank, but that new money, which I can then spend, obviously, and that's the whole point of getting a loan, didn't come from anywhere else. It was newly added to the money supply. Now, the reason why this works, why this can even be done, because it sounds kind of, if it's the first time you hear this, you'll think, really? I mean, how does that work?
Sounds dangerous too.
Yes, well, it goes back to English law when modern banking was created in the 17th century, and the whole legal concepts were also created at the same time. And you see, at law, there's no such thing as a bank deposit. It's simply a loan to the bank. So we are lending money to the bank. Sort of the tables are turned actually at law. And you'll say, I don't mind, but if I take out a loan, I want to have the money. Give me the money. And the banker will say, okay, we'll put the money into your account if they're careful. They may say, we'll transfer it to your account, which would be incorrect. What happens is that the banker purchases the loan contract, which is actually a security, a debt instrument, an IOU, a promissory note. So the balance sheet of the bank lengthens on the asset side, and then the borrower, your account will be credited because remember, deposits aren't actually legally privileged. It's a record of what the bank owes us. The bank owes you now money. That's what we call a deposit. So it's really the record of the accounts payable liability arising from the loan contract that has been rebooked, if you want, as another type of liability called customer deposit, despite no customer depositing it. So the bank invents the money, and that's what we could confirm. So it is a bit of a fudge. Um, and of course, throughout history, it's not something the banks wanted people to really understand very well because that's part of the power of banking. And also the credibility. They build these edifices with pillars and, there is real money here, big safe places. They used to have a bit of gold, which they perhaps would show off, but actually it's simply a credit system where you take notes. Okay, we're creating a new credit for this person. Actually, in the US, because for a long time there was no central bank, and in those days it was more obvious because there was paper money, banknotes, as the name says. These were notes issued by banks, promissory notes. And of course, how do they issue them? Well, when you take a loan, they print new money. So then it was quite obvious. Of course, when you have a
Right.
central bank, it
That's
becomes
interesting.
less obvious, but it's still the same economics.
Yeah, so that's interesting. And so, to your point in describing the Japanese situation and really financial crises, a whole class of them, an element of the problem or way of understanding is that for various reasons, some the actual substantive health of the bank balance sheet, if they have a lot of bad loans, some the psychological trauma maybe of so many bad loans, banks essentially stop doing this creation of money, which is so vital to the health and growth of the economy. And so
Exactly.
is that in a sense the problem then that something like quantitative easing is aimed at addressing?
Yes, exactly. That was the original idea with quantitative easing, that we don't need to have a recession just because there's a bit of an accounting problem in the financial system. Why are actual people losing their jobs and, unemployment grows and all that, when really it's just a numbers problem. And these numbers, if you arrange them properly, you can solve that problem, even within the
Right.
law. And the central bank
Right.
can
It's
do
an
that.
interesting right. It's an interesting point that when you have this sort of crisis going on, nothing has actually changed in a sense in the real world. Everybody's individual productive capacity, the potential of the factories, the base of physical capital, the consumer demand, it's all still there. It's this it's this almost removed behavior in the financial markets that is the problem. And so this is then the second big sort of conceptual question in my mind is when you say, okay, so in this case, the central bank can step in and purchase, essentially exchange, give cash to the banks, and the banks give their non-performing or toxic loans to the central bank. How does that transaction actually occur? What is the actual asset that the central bank is exchanging? Is it itself just creating money? Is it using some other base of assets that it already has?
Yes, so for this QE1, the first part of quantitative easing, which is about cleaning up bank balance sheets, the central bank buys the non performing assets from the banks. So they are literally transferred. I mean, the title is transferred to these, securities. And what do the banks get in exchange? Well, they get a credit at the central bank, which, of course, for banks is very helpful because that is, that's pure liquidity. Actually, it's called usually a reserve. Reserves at the central bank. They used to be, in the old days um, in gold, but of course the gold link is gone, so it's just a credit. Nowadays, of course, a digital entry. I mean, we've been using digital money for a long time, and the money creation by banks has been digital money. And so the central bank credits the banks with something, digital units at the central bank. But that's very helpful because for regulatory purposes, banks have to make sure they meet all the bank regulations um, for the regulators, and they're having a lot of central bank reserves at the central bank is extremely good for you. That really shows you have a strong balance sheet, highly liquid, and all that. And so the banks will be quite happy about that deal, and they don't have to worry about the non-performing assets. So that's why it works.
Right. And so is that credit, to your point, we're not literally printing money because there's no paper being passed around. It's digital. But is it fair to consider that the digital equivalent of printing money? The central bank is just
Um,
declaring money exists where none was before?
no, it doesn't work because basically when you do create money and it's therefore injected into the economy, there will always be some impact in terms of inflation, either consumer price inflation if it's used for consumption, or asset price inflation if it's used for purchasing assets. And that's usually the problem why you run into a financial crisis in the first place, right? But when the central bank cleans up bank balance sheets by buying the non-performing assets, this doesn't actually create money. The reason is that, I mean, you could say it's sort of internal money that never hits the economy because the banks get credited at the central bank, but uh, because the money stays in the banking system, and the banking system consists of the central bank and the banks together. And money creation is when money comes out from the banking system into the non-bank economy, and that's not happening. You see, through this QE1, therefore, you can't create inflation, and also it's therefore not really directly yet stimulating the economy. And that's why I proposed the second step, QE2,
Right.
where the central bank has a way of forcing banks to now create money and inject it into the economy.
Right. And so I guess my last question about QE1 is that in the sort of moment of a crisis, it sounds very appealing. Banks had all of these non performing loans, these are dragging down financial markets in various ways. We can essentially snap our fingers and that's gone.
Yeah, that's right.
It's not a free lunch, though. Two possible objections to this come to mind. Either one, this is essentially a massive bailout of the banks because they are not. We're saying we can't afford to have you struggle, therefore you shall not. Or two, we are reallocating these losses within the economy. I feel like it's wrong to say to the taxpayers, but some very unproductive loss behaving, producing activity did underlie this crisis. We can't actually just make it vanish.
Yeah.
So where does it go? What are the other sort of consequences we're creating here that we might be less happy about?
Yes. Well, first of all, it is a bailout. There's no doubt. I mean, that is what it is. It's a bailout of the banks. And of course, when you have a bailout, and often they're done by tax money, by the government using fiscal policy, that's actually much more costly, less efficient, and is a huge distortion. And governments do it all the time. So it's actually an improvement to say, okay, the central bank is now doing it instead of the government in a way that actually will be much cheaper for the taxpayer because tax money is not actually used. In fact, it is a free lunch. Now, you may be surprised to hear this, and this is the second point. Um, it looks like, it can't be right. There has to be some kind of cost. But you see, the cost happened already. The cost to society, and it can be a serious, big cost to society, happened when the banks misallocated resources and created new money and gave it for bad purposes. That was the cost to society. By then saying, okay, now we're going to not bail out the banks, and we're going to just sit tight. And then the banks get risk averse, the non performing loans get worse, the banks reduce lending, the economy shrinks, unemployment goes up, 20-year recession in the Japanese case as a result of this. What you've done is there was some spilled milk and you kept spilling more. Basically, you add new costs to society that are avoidable. And so that's what one has to understand, that the initial cost is already in the past. And that's when the money was lent for asset purchases. If all banks created credit lent only for productive business investment, implementing new technologies and upgrading, increasing efficiency, adding value, you never get a banking crisis. So, and therefore, actually, that leads us to the other point, this moral hazard issue. If we bail out
Right.
banks, we're sort of rewarding them. So who's to blame? Actually, it is the regulators, because they should have seen this and they did have the data. They did see this when the bad lending was done for asset purchases. That always leads to first an asset bubble and then the banking crisis. It's just, there's dozens of examples in history. It's always the same pattern. And actually, therefore, it's the central banks that are to blame. They should have avoided the whole problem. This is resource misallocation in the first place. They chose not to, so they should pay. And of course, that's what the moral hazard principle says. So we're actually quite sound in those terms, and that's why it also works. And because this bailout, cleaning up balance sheets, doesn't create money, it doesn't inject money into the economy. It doesn't lead to inflation, and therefore it's a free lunch in the sense that it doesn't create new costs, whereas other measures, they actually create new costs on top of the spilled milk of the bad lending
Right.
in the past.
Right. Well, and I think from a sort of economic efficiency perspective, I think the point makes a lot of sense that the bad loans already happened, the resources have been
Exactly.
misallocated. There's obviously no point in just sort of standing, pointing and laughing as
Yeah.
as things get worse. That being said, maybe this is more a matter of economic justice than economic efficiency. I think and this connects to the moral hazard point, but it seems to me there's clearly a problem if we are operating a system in which when the banks make good loans, they and their equity holders get all the profits of those. But when they make bad loans, because that's so socially costly, they shouldn't actually bear the cost of that. And I don't actually accept the view that this is actually the regulator or the central banker's fault, because in a sense it suggests a model in which the sort of a central planning mechanism is superior to market competition in allocating resources in the first place. I mean, the reason we have relatively free financial markets, the reason we allow people to make large profits in them is presumably because we think they can do a better job allocating the resources than the central bank could. And so when they do it badly, we want to protect the rest of society from that. But surely there must be
Yes.
some consequence. Is it, can we wipe out their equity? What
Exactly.
what
Well,
what
I mean,
should
you're
happen?
right, and these are really good points you're raising. And it's, starting out with your first point, that is a question of economic justice, and that is very true. So really, the banks that did the bad lending should suffer the consequences, which is they would fail. But society decided we don't want that because of other consequences, and basically ordinary people didn't have time to analyze different banks, credit decision making processes. So we can't punish them for it. So basically, the Federal Reserve was created in order to then step in and also be a lender of last resort when there's a run on the banks. So there were some reasons why this would make sense. And so the decision was made, okay, we're not usually letting these banks fail. There will be some kind of rearrangement, they will be merged with other banks or something. But as soon as you have a central bank, then actually, because it has powers, it also has, it asks for all the information from the banks in real time, who they're lending to. And then that knowledge, since we've taken the decision that we have these central banks, actually should be used to avoid the worst of these crises. And that can be easily done without any central planning type of, Soviet style intervention, very light touch. In fact, I would argue this is actually minimalist banking regulation, because we at the moment have massive excessive bank regulation, creating a huge burden for banks and therefore for society. And the goal has been of this bank regulation to prevent banking crises. Well, it's failed consistently. We still have banking crises, and nobody's arguing that we can't have another banking crisis coming because we've now increased bank regulation so much, or we're confident it's not going to happen. Well, no, nobody's confident. Well, I'm confident we're not going to have a banking crisis if we do the following: scrap all existing bank regulation and only have one very simplistic, minimalist rule, which also means then you can be hands off and let the markets play. And the rule, really, the only rule you need in bank regulation is the following: because bank lending, there's basically three types. Two types are bad and create costs for society, and one type, there's no cost for society. The two types that are problematic is bank credit for consumption. And the reason is, when you create, when you give a loan, you create money. It's the money creation issue that we started out with, because that's actually a public privilege that affects everyone in society. If somebody makes a decision, we're going to add to the money supply. Well, that affects, everyone's purchasing power because it's going to be diluted. And when you create new money, but you don't create more goods and services, but you just create more demand through consumer loans, you're going to get consumer price inflation. That's why we had this inflation in 22. It was the result and consequence of the massive money creation in 2020 by the central banks, which was used for consumption. So that's one thing, and that's bad credit. Basically, you could say, well, we'll ban bank credit for consumption. It doesn't mean that nobody should be able to borrow for consumption. It should be from non-banks. See, the banking license is that privilege to create money. So that should only be given when banks create money for productive business investment, because that adds value to society and contributes to GDP, national income. But there's one more type which is also bad, and that is when bank credit is given to purchase assets, any type of asset, but usually it's either real estate, property, or financial assets. And again, the problem is that bank lending is money creation, and that therefore then creates this problem, because if you, let's say, the banks, and they usually follow each other and copy each other, if they start lending more for real estate, property, because it's money creation, it's like printing money, pumping it into the real estate market. What's going to happen with real estate prices? They're going to go up. And that looks good in the beginning. Everyone's making money, everyone's balance sheet is growing. But by definition, it's unsustainable, because this will continue while you keep expanding bank credit for asset
Right.
purchases. Until when? Well, it can be 10 years, 20 years. But the moment you don't increase this lending anymore, that's when the house of cards comes down. And then you have a banking crisis, because the late coming speculators, they need further rises. They're not going to happen because bank credit is now going down. They go bankrupt, the first non-performing loans, the banks get risk averse, they reduce lending for asset purchases. The whole thing goes into reverse, and you have non-performing loans. And from the peak, asset prices only need to drop by 15%, and you've wiped out bank equity,
Right.
because the losses have to come from bank equity. You get a banking crisis. So this
Yeah.
lending for consumption and lending for property assets in general, these are the problematic ones. And I'm not saying let's ban speculation. No, you can never do that. But also, that's not sensible. But because bank lending, banking is a privileged job, and you get a banking license, that should only be used for particular things, namely the third possibility, bank credit for productive business investment, and
Right.
lending to small firms that invest, that add value, produce something, goods and services. Then you have money creation, but also contribution to GDP and national income, and you have no inflation, you have no asset inflation, and you have no crisis. That's
Right.
that's
This is
what you need to.
fascinating. Yeah, because it's fascinating. This connects very directly to one of the central arguments we make at American Compass between what we would call real investment and speculation in
Exactly.
assets. And
Exactly.
it always shows up. The instance that drives me most nuts is when people celebrate what they call foreign direct investment.
Yes.
And most of foreign direct investment is just money pouring in to buy existing assets.
Exactly.
Likewise, when a private equity
Very
fund
true.
buys a company, it's not investing in the company, it's buying assets. And
Exactly.
I always like to remind people of, I'm a huge Mary Poppins fan. And of course, most people think the lesson from Mary Poppins for central bankers is the scene with the bank run. I actually think the important lesson is the scene just before that, when the bankers were trying to explain to the kid what they're going to do with his money. And it's a reminder what an investment bank, what that actually meant. It meant that the investment bank was going to finance the actual uh, capital investment in the economy. And somehow we have switched into a financial system where what a quote investment bank does is very little actual investment, and almost entirely that third category of asset acquisition that uh, people will say creates liquidity, et cetera, maybe has some value, but is not the actual creation of productive
Exactly.
capacity. So
Exactly.
thinking about that from the perspective of who's allowed to create money in the first place is a very interesting lens on it.
That's right. And so
But I,
just with the bank regulation, so
yeah,
basically, if we only had that one rule that banks can only lend for purposes that contribute to national income, to GDP, namely business investment, but not for consumption and not for asset purchases, and you get non-bank specialized mortgage lenders, they're non-bank and they can do it, but not banks, you would never get a banking crisis. And because the regulators have been aware of this, I mean, I certainly have been publishing it and sending it to regulators, and they've even published the BIS on its website, my contribution. They could have done this decades ago, but they choose not to. So they are to blame because it's not for lack of knowledge. They like the cycles, you see. They like to create these
yeah,
boom bust cycles because each time the central banks create another crisis, we give them more powers. The politicians are quick to, they want to do something. The central bankers whisper in their ears, oh, it's because we weren't powerful enough. We need more regulatory powers.
right.
And then each time they
Well,
get powerful. So that's regulatory moral hazard. And therefore, they have an incentive to create more crises because it makes them more powerful.
and yeah, and to your point about the boom and bust cycle, the sugar high of generating what looks like economic growth through the other forms of
Exactly.
lending are very politically popular,
Yeah,
and then when it all comes down, you can blame the bankers and then do it do it all
exactly.
again, I guess. But I want
Absolutely.
to spend. We could spend 3 more hours just on this as a model of banking regulation, which would be maybe we'll have to do another episode on that. But I want to spend at least a few minutes on QE2 because
Yes.
something just so helpful to me. And I'm always wondering, like, okay, what is QE2 except more QE, right? Like, I'm not sure why we're putting a two after it. And what I hear you saying in your description, there are obviously differences in what exactly is happening. There's also a very sort of core difference in the telos of it. That the point here is not to clean up, bail out the banks. Now it is effectively a monetary rather than fiscal stimulus, where we are basically the central bank is becoming a market actor in a sense, transacting in perfectly healthy assets. And so describe just so is what is the mechanism there at the point where the Federal Reserve says, well, I'm just going to go out and buy a bunch of assets from non-banks. What is actually happening then?
Yes. And that is precisely the correct definition of what I call QE2, the second part of my original QE. It basically is a way of forcing banks to massively expand the money supply through, forcing them to create credit, and that can be done when the central bank buys assets from non-banks, and then the banks are forced to credit these non-banks in their deposit accounts with banks, and that's how the money is created. Um, and well, we saw that this was done in March 2020 at a massive scale, absolutely off the charts.
Well, before the pandemic, Mike. So is it correct that QE2 was going on though in the U.S.
Well, they
significantly in the post
that
recession
well that
period?
that was more of QE1, and
Okay.
also, well, there is a third type of QE, fake QE, what I call QE3, which the Bank of Japan did. I mean, I originally published this for Japan in '95 in Japan, but the Bank of Japan refused to do it. And they said, no, we don't need it. Then in 2001, they said, okay, we'll try this QE, but it's not going to work. And so they wanted to set out to prove it's not going to work. And what they did is, instead of buying non-performing assets from banks, um, or the QE2 buying, performing assets from non-banks, they bought performing assets from banks. In other words, they just bought bonds in the bond market and off the banks. But that's, we're not talking about non-performing assets, just performing assets. And
Right.
that's a marginal impact. It creates marginal extra profits for the banks, but it doesn't really do much. It's sort of it helps creating a bond market bubble, which itself is not such a great thing in the long run anyway. But that's what they did, and so that's in the U.S. they call that QE2 because, well, basically the second, in just terms of chronology, the timing when the second instance of QE happened, they called it QE2, and then people stopped counting QE3, 4, 5, but it was all the
Right.
same type of just buying more assets, usually just in the markets or off the banks, and it doesn't really do that much if you buy from the banks, because normally central banks only work with banks; they're the main, counterparty. And if you buy performing assets from banks, well, it doesn't have a tremendous impact. And that's what we saw. It sort of just stimulates in general asset markets, which usually was the problem in the first place. you know, and so unfortunately, most of the time, the last 30 years, that's what happened. But then, and also the Bank of Japan would even literally say, "Oh, what you're suggesting, buying assets from non-banks, we can't do that. We can't do that." But in March 2020, suddenly all the central banks could do it, and they knew exactly how to do it. The Federal Reserve even hired BlackRock to help them do it in March
Hmm.
2020. And of course, when you do that, you massively rev up this money creation. So they bought all these assets. The Federal Reserve bought the corporate bonds issued by companies, so putting it um, into the corporate bond market and other asset markets. And then, of course, at the same time, there were these government programs making sure fiscal policy was very stimulatory and consumption was being encouraged. So you had this more money pouring into the economy and consumption encouraged. So consumption, of course, increased significantly and inflation um, happened at double digit rates, which is what I warned about since May 2020. I've been tweeting, well, we're going to get significant inflation based on this. And it wasn't to do with a war or oil prices or gas prices. It was literally the money creation of 2020 that 18 months later had to create this inflation because they were restricting supply and the central banks were increasing demand by printing money that essentially was, or getting the banks to print money that was going to be used for consumption. So it had to result in inflation. So that's a sad use of QE2, my original QE2. It was meant for deflationary shrinking economy.
Right.
The Bank of Japan didn't use it for that purpose, and then they used it to create this inflation.
Yeah. So a final question is, I think, and maybe this goes to the kind of fake QE2 of say the 2010 to 2015 period in the U.S. There's a very interesting debate, particularly among conservatives, about Federal Reserve and interest rate policy and whether lower or, in a sense, whether lower or higher interest rates are better, um, and and whether the sort of zero interest rate policy that was intended to be so stimulative of investment, ideally lead to tighter labor markets and so forth, was a way to do that, or if in fact it had the opposite effect, and that really all you were doing was sort of creating these asset bubbles, enriching the exact people who did not need the help, and doing nothing for the actual productive investment in the economy.
Absolutely.
How I wonder, I can guess what your view on that is,
Yeah.
but would love to sort of
Yes.
hear your view on it from through this lens that you've been
Exactly.
describing.
Well, it is the second possibility you mentioned. So it's basically it encouraged the unproductive activity. But there is an interesting story here because central banks have been arguing this, making this case that interest rates are their key variable, and so they're using that as the key tool for monetary policy. And a lot of the analysis is therefore focusing on interest rates, and they use that then to make their case. Now we need to stimulate, so we need to lower rates. But all that is actually not very sound as an argument. It's because it's entirely based on theoretical models that make premises that don't hold. Um, Even though, ironically, almost all schools of thought in modern economics for the last 200 years would agree that if you lower rates, you get higher growth. If you raise rates, you get slower growth. Well, in fact, these are all schools of equilibrium economics that say that because in equilibrium, it's prices that are key. They give us this equilibrium, and the price of money is the overall price that moves the economy. That's the logic. Well, there's news for you. There is no equilibrium. Because if you read the small print, the number of conditions required and assumptions to hold for there to be equilibrium in any one market is so unlikely that we know it's never going to happen, let alone what they say is general equilibrium and is proclaimed general equilibrium in all markets simultaneously. It's fiction. This is fiction economics. And if you do an empirical test, simply what is the relationship between interest rates and economic growth? I only recently published this, two papers, because the journals didn't really want to publish this. They hated this. It was open ended. Let's just look at the data. What is actually the relation between interest rates and growth? It's supposed to be negative, right? Low rates, higher growth. And causation is supposed to be from interest rates to growth. Turns out empirically, looking at, in one paper, looked at the four major economies, US, Japan, Germany, and the UK for half a century, long term study. The other one was more short term, but looking at 19 countries. The result is the opposite of what they tell us, the opposite of this equilibrium economic theory in both dimensions. So the correlation is not negative, it's positive. And statistical causation, Granger causality, is more likely to run from economic growth to interest rates than from interest rates to growth. So they tell us low rates lead to higher growth. That's a theory. There's never been empirical evidence for that. What we find evidence for is that higher growth leads to higher rates. Lower growth leads to lower rates. So when the central banks busted the banks and banks became risk averse, reduced lending, economic growth goes down, and then it's natural that rates come down because they follow growth. And of course, that's also why in autumn 22, rates had to spike because they, through this money creation, they boosted nominal GDP significantly. There's a lag, and then interest rates rise. And so it was inevitable. It was going to happen. Perhaps the central banks actually, they sort of delayed it as much as they could, and then they had a huge spike, which is not a great idea. That hurts banks, if you
Right.
do it suddenly. So
Yeah.
so basically there's a misunderstanding in terms of economic reality. And the central banks, well, I think they know it. They just like to use this theoretical argument because they use interest rates as a great sort of decoy. Look, we are trying to help. We're lowering rates. Well, really, it's the quantity of credit and money that's driving things. And that's where they can, behind closed doors, do their thing, and people don't know what they're up to. so I've always followed the quantity of credit creation, and that has lead
Yeah.
qualities, and interest rates tend to follow.
Yeah.
So your question, is should rates be high or low? Well, actually, empirically, we find they just follow growth. Now, it is possible, that's the final point, it is possible to have higher growth. We just need to make sure more of the money creation, as you're also saying, should be used for productive business investment, not for speculation. Then you get higher growth, and that will push up rates. But don't worry about that. That's quite natural. They will follow growth. There is enough money to go around to service and repay those loans and at higher rates because we now have more productive business investment, technology, higher value added. And that's how you get a virtual cycle. Of course, that's exactly how the East Asian high growth economies have done it. They made sure bank credit doesn't go for consumption, it's not used for asset purchase, but mainly for productive business investment. Then you rev it up, get double digit growth. Yes, that pushes up rates, but it's not a problem. Everyone can handle it because we have abundance and wealth
Right.
creation, which we can generate in any country.
Yeah, the equilibrium point is fascinating. It's exactly what we see in what economists have gotten wrong on trade policy. You see it all
Yes,
the
it's the
time in
same also on the
misunderstanding
trade side.
of
I
labor
agree.
markets and immigration. And so this is a fascinating application. We will have to leave it there. Maybe part one of several. This has been fascinating. So many more questions I want to ask.
Thank you.
Richard Werner, thank you so
Very
much for
good
joining us.
questions. It's been great talking to you. Thank you.
And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass podcast.